holiday is certainly a little bit strange. Here it is, the beginning of October, and we're going to be eating outside tonight in our sukkah, probably with our winter coats on. Everybody else has taken in the lawn furniture for the season. They're getting ready for winter, and here we are going outside to eat. So we really have to ask, what is this holiday of Sukkot? Now, on one level, the answer is fairly straightforward. There are three festivals in the Jewish calendar: Passover, Shavuot, and Sukkot. And each of these festivals is associated with the events of the Torah. So obviously Passover commemorates the Exodus from Egypt, Shavuot, the revelation, the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai, and Sukkot is the holiday that commemorates the wandering in the wilderness. The Torah states that 7 days you shall live in Sukkot, which are huts or booths, so that future generations will know that I made you live in Sukkot, in booths, when I took you out of the land of Egypt. So that by observing these three festivals every year, we really are reenacting the cycle of these historical events. But on a deeper level, Sukkot is a very meaningful holiday. And I'm going to approach it from this direction. There is a custom on Sukkot. I don't know that we've ever done this at Agudas Achim, but in many synagogues, the custom is to read the book of Ecclesiastes on the Sabbath during Sukkot. Now, the book of Ecclesiastes in the Bible is also an unusual book. It begins with the famous phrase, vanity of vanities. Everything is vanity. Now, the word that is translated into English as vanity in Hebrew is hevel. Hevel is really a breath, just a very short breath. It's interesting that all of the words that have to do with the soul, the spirit in Hebrew, are words that are connected with breathing. The word neshama, or neshama, which is a soul, comes from the word linshom, to breathe. Ruach, which means spirit, comes from the word wind. Ruach is wind. Also the word nephesh, which is another word which is used for soul or life, also has to do with breathing. But this word hevel means really a very shallow breath, a short breath. And it is about how precarious life is. So that when Ecclesiastes says vanity of vanities, really the phrase is a breath that is insubstantial. Our life is like a breath. You know, there's a character in the Bible who has the name Hevel. In English, we call him Abel, of Cain and Abel fame. And of course, Abel was the first man to die. And I think that's why his name was Hevel. His life, again, was just like a shallow breath. It was just, he was born, he lived a short while, and he died. He was murdered by his brother. And so the theme of the book of Ecclesiastes is this idea that life is precarious. And everything that we do in life, and Ecclesiastes goes on to talk about how we pursue things, we pursue wealth, even that we pursue knowledge. We write books, he talks about. But all of it is still vanity of vanities, because ultimately our life is like a breath. And so what is the permanence of anything that we either obtain or achieve? And that is the theme of the book. And it's interesting that we read that book on Sukkot, because when you think about it, what is a sukkah? We leave our house, which is a permanent structure, at least we hope it's permanent, and we go out to live in a temporary structure, in a booth, a hut that is constructed. It doesn't even have to have a full 4 walls to be a sukkah. But the real essence of the sukkah is not even the walls. Because if you remember back in the old synagogue on War Memorial, the sukkah there was a permanent structure. But what makes the sukkah a sukkah? It's the roof, which has to be made out of something that is natural and that is porous, so that number one, we can see the stars through the roof of the sukkah, but also that it can rain into the sukkah. That is actually an essential feature of the sukkah, that it has to be vulnerable to the forces of nature. I actually remember attending a lecture many years ago that somebody came up with a design for a sukkah that was completely halachic. Everything about its construction was in accordance with halacha, but it was designed in a way that rain could not get in through the roof of the sukkah. And the authorities, all of the halachic experts, ruled that that's not a kosher sukkah. It has to be able to rain into the sukkah. Now, not that we wanted to. That's not to say that we're hoping it's going to rain. Quite the opposite. As a matter of fact, in the Talmud, there's a statement that says rain is a siman klala. It's a sign, it's a bad sign. Because here we want to go out and do this mitzvah of sitting in the sukkah, and if it rains, the water gets into our soup. And of course, there are all kinds of debates and discussions, and people really struggle with this on years when there is rain on Sukkot, of what do you do? Because you don't have to sit there in the rain. If the water's coming in and it's dripping into your soup, you can go inside and eat. But the point here is that the sukkah has to be vulnerable to these forces of nature. It has to be a temporary structure. And I think the point is that for these 7 days of Sukkot, we move into this temporary structure, which is precarious, which in a way is a metaphor for life. Life is temporary and it's precarious. We've seen over the last few months just how vulnerable we are to forces in nature that we can't even see. And so that's the lesson of the sukkah. It's about the temporariness and the precariousness of life. And yet what do? We go into the sukkah and we eat our meals in there. And just by doing that act, we are observing a mitzvah. I would say sukkah is the only mitzvah that you can really get your whole body into, right? We can go into the sukkah, and by sitting in the sukkah, we are doing a mitzvah. And so what we are really showing by that is that despite the precariousness and the temporary nature of life, we can do something that has greater value, that is connected with something larger than ourselves, and that is to perform this mitzvah of sitting in the sukkah. A lot of times on Sukkot, it is either cold or it's hot. And how people are. People sometimes complain. I know we get bees in the sukkah sometimes. I remember a friend of mine, when we first moved up to Chicago, we used to eat in his sukkah every year. And he had a poster in the sukkah of a rabbi. And he used to point to that poster and he'd say, you want to complain about the heat or the cold. He says, that man built a sukkah in Auschwitz. Now, what does it mean he built a sukkah in Auschwitz? Obviously, it doesn't mean, he didn't go to Home Depot and get boards and stuff in order to make a sukkah, right? It means probably he took a string and put it up somehow, because in halacha there are discussions about what constitutes a wall. You don't actually have to have a board that makes a wall. You can have something that's a barrier that makes a wall. So he probably put up some kind of a string, and who knows, maybe he somehow found a branch somewhere and held it over his head. Whatever he did to so-called build a sukkah, the point is that despite looking and around him and living in a place where he was surrounded by nothing but horrible things, he said, I'm going to preserve this mitzvah. I'm going to do what God has commanded us to do despite all of this. And to me, that's a very powerful message. And I think that it is a message that, although thank God we don't have to deal with those horrors, but nonetheless, we still, despite all of the blessings that we have, despite the fact that we are living in a land where we can freely observe our religion, nonetheless, we need to remember the precariousness of life. And if we want to find something permanent, if we want to find something that's going to give ultimate meaning to our lives, it is by observing the Torah and by doing the mitzvot. And so that's why we go out to this little hut that's so easily blown over, that's so easily rained into, that's so easily either it's too hot or it's too cold, and yet we sit there and we do a mitzvah. I want to wish everyone a good Shabbos and a good Yontif.